Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help you, our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island, make your second half of life even better than the first. With the relentless march of digital technology over the last few decades, we've seen our society increasingly focused on making life faster, easier, convenient, more comfortable. But there's an underside to this pervasive technology. Modernity is working against many of our physical, intellectual, and emotional needs, according to a growing body of research. It's actually making us age faster. In today's episode, Dr. Sherry Kelly, a widely recognized clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist, talks about her 30 years experience researching and exploring ways to keep our brain vibrant in a digital age. It's not an easy challenge. Even as the pandemic proceeds, there's still not enough face to face time or time spent outdoors. We remain entrenched in our 24-hour news cycle and enclosed world of social media and streaming, and a largely sedentary lifestyle. Yet each of us has more power than we may think to control aging, says Dr. Kelly. We do have choices and options, but they often require us to be proactive, to change our lifestyle, gain emotional flexibility, and revise our personal expectations. A frequent lecturer on neuroscience, health and wellness, and positive psychology, Dr. Kelly will provide her insights on how managing digital technology can help prevent cognitive decline. She'll also describe her work with children, researching the impact of digital technology and social media on the development of social skills in youth. Along with her daughter, Caitlin Kelly, she founded Positivities workshops, which provide coaching and webinars to educate diverse audiences about how digital technology is not only affecting their social skills in youth, but changing the developing brains. As a young teen, Caitlin was personally impacted by the high school shooting up in her childhood hometown of Parkland, Florida, where she witnessed the unfolding violence upon friends and neighbors via unfiltered social media. So now let's meet our guest, Dr. Sherry Kelly, and hear how she can help us manage the impact of digital technology on our well-being as we age. So, Sherry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ron. Hello. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. I've seen some of your presentations before, and our audience is in for a treat. So
Oh,
before we
thank
dive into things, Sherry, just tell us a little bit about your background, about how you got involved in your particular area of expertise. I find that not only I'm interested in the content of my expert guests, but also their lives. This is that, and the 45 Forward Life is really an interesting transition chapter to chapter. So just give us a quick rundown on how you got to where you are today.
Okay. I started doing research in developmental psychology back in the 70s
Hmm.
and was really interested in how people transition from one stage of their life to another, not only socially transition, but also in terms of their neurology network. How does the brain change to accommodate for the changes in life? I was also really interested in how the brain learns. And of course, back then, 45 years ago, we didn't have the neuroimaging that we have now. So I was lucky enough to go through training, go through school, and then postgraduate work as the science of psychology really exploded with
Hmm.
the advent of neuroimaging. So I moved from being, really interested in educational psychology and developmental psychology into neuropsychology through the lifespan. So I've studied and I did research and work with people with debilitating chronic illnesses as well as
Hmm.
chronic disease, cancer, brain tumors. So, I've really had sort of a lifelong learning laboratory in this field of psychology. And of course, as I started to age, I was really curious to know, well, what does the evidence say? What does the science say about aging? And how can I explain that in simple terms to friends and colleagues? In other words, I really wanted to take the lab to the laptop
Hmm.
about the science of aging, and that's what I do.
Right. That's great. That's great. Yeah. So we'll talk about the whole gamut of your work, because, um, certainly there's impacts on aging, but these impacts start much earlier in life and they
Mhm.
progress. But what I found interesting about your work too is that while a lot of people have kind of, you know, a general sense of, well, our involvement and the impact of digital technology is significant, but specifically, so we have a feeling like a lot of this is not good. A lot of it is very helpful. Certainly, when you want to find out information, you just Google it these days. You don't have to look for the Encyclopedia Britannica.
Right.
But so there are lots of benefits to technology. But what specifically? I know you look at you talked about some specific impacts on the brain of of
Yes.
gaming, of you. I think you mentioned. I heard you talk about the fact, which well, it's intuitively I get it, but when you actually say it is amazing. Like we spend a whole day, 24 hours during the course of a week on digital media.
Yes. Yeah. You're giving up a full day of your week, at least. Some
Hmm.
people more, some people a little bit less, but on average, you're giving up a full day of your week to social media and entertainment and gaming,
Right, right,
not online work.
right,
So, that is a really big impact on your life. And I
right.
think when people see that in print or they think about it that way, they're taken aback.
Right, right. And I think you talk about some interesting specific impacts. So you talk about what
Yeah,
is the impact of, again, we're exposed to multiple sources of fast-paced stimuli, and that does
right,
something to the brain. So talk
right.
about that a bit.
All right. Well, these are all good things to start off with. Well, first of all, I want to explain that it's my opinion as a clinician for over 3 decades. Not all of this has been scientifically proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but I'm basing this a lot on what scientific evidence there is and what I've noticed from actually doing neuropsychological evaluations for over 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I really believe that our brains with our modern lifestyle have become lazy.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain doesn't like modernity the way that it's playing out.
Mm-hmm.
The role of the brain, the purpose of the brain is to keep us alive.
Right.
Right? It's about survival. That's why it's there. Okay. It's not to go on Tinder or to get likes. The purpose of the brain is to keep us alive. Okay. And for millennia, the brain has been developing to keep us alive in different situations, most importantly, of keeping us on the move,
Mm-hmm.
right? We had to stay on the move as cave people, right?
Right.
To avoid that saber-toothed tiger,
Mm-hmm.
or to go hunting, or to find shelter, or to go into battle, right? We were very proactive human beings to stay alive.
Right.
Well, now, so many of us spend much of our day being reactive people instead of proactive people.
Mm-hmm.
We react, we respond, but we're not really thinking, planning, and doing.
Right.
We sit there in our chair attached to our laptops or our phones, and we're clicking or
Right.
swiping. Okay. And that's some kind of activity that is novel for the brain, and one that's not really aligned with the evolution of the brain. Does that make sense to
Yeah.
you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that and there's sort of an addictive quality to this reactivity. It's there for
Yes.
you. I do find myself, often right with your cell phone, and you're getting emails or getting tweets or whatever,
Right.
or texts, and the phone pings, and you're like, oh, I got to answer that, and so you don't have to answer that really, but it basically it basically is a I don't want to make too close an analogy, but right when you go into a casino, when you hear you know
It's a good analogy, actually.
the
Yes. I mean, we now have, we have a conditioned response to that ping,
hmm
right? And what happens is just even hearing the ping that you have email sets off this chain reaction in your brain, and you start getting a shot of dopamine. So yes, there's a neurochemical reaction to getting email and opening email. Same thing with likes on Instagram or getting responses. Yeah. And
Yeah.
then certainly if your online behavior is gaming, it's very much like gambling. It might even be gambling, right? And they're very, very smart in what they do in setting up the games and also the algorithms
Yeah. Yeah.
of different sites. So,
Yeah.
the good news is that if you know this, and if you're an informed consumer, you will be able to tap into the power that you really have
Right.
to not get sucked into this all day.
Right.
Because being in that state of online presence and being in a state of reactivity or being, I guess, enmeshed with the computer program um, is something that can accelerate aging.
Right. Right. Yeah. So we'll move on to that, but before that, I just wanted to expand a little bit on your notion of the making the brain lazy, because I think I
Yeah.
found this interesting in terms of how you've described it, which is actually that by being exposed to multiple fast stimuli, whether it's in the internet or wherever you're looking at, that it actually your brain kind of downshifts,
Yeah,
right?
your brain is downshifting, and I'm explaining this in very simple terms. So if
Mm-hmm.
there's a colleague that's listening to this, they're going to say I'm oversimplifying it, but yes, I am oversimplifying it, so we understand.
Right.
um, yeah, so you just imagine if your brain is being confronted with all these pixels and
Mm.
all these sounds and all this information and visual stimuli coming at you, your brain's going to react in a way to accommodate for all that stimuli. And one way that it can accommodate, depending on the stimuli, is that it's going to downshift like a car. And it's going to think to itself, and you know what? I don't need to react. I don't need to act so quickly. I can just sit back and be entertained. I can just sort of like coast because I don't need to act. I'm just going to respond and watch.
Right.
So, the brain is in this activity of really being reactive and responsive and taking in a lot of information. The brain doesn't have to work so hard to organize things or process things because it's coming at you.
Right. Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And another thing that I like one of your analogies is that I don't know if you coined it, but the sort of what you call cognitive tenderizing,
Yeah,
which is
cognitive tenderizing.
yeah,
And I did not coin it. I wish I did.
uh-huh,
Yes. So, the dating app Tinder,
mm-hmm,
where you swipe left or right. Um, your brain kind of goes into that mode with some of these platforms, and I'm going to explain why.
mm-hmm,
So, back in the 60s, when computer programs were literally very basic, that's
mm-hmm,
what most of us grew up learning was basic, right? Um, these applications were first developed for consumerism. Let's buy something,
mm-hmm,
let's use this to sell stuff. Okay. And it was very easy and it was very primitive. It was based on basically a binary system, 1 0, on off, yes, no. So many of the consumer applications and even educational apps we have today for kids are based on this same very simple technology.
mm-hmm.
On off, yes, no, right, wrong, 1 0, like, cute, not cute, date, not date, right?
Right.
And what I see happening with especially younger people um, is this reliance on yes, no thinking, all or nothing thinking, left, right thinking, swipe right, swipe left thinking, having two choices
Mm-hmm.
only, wanting only two choices.
Right.
So what happens is that we become very uncomfortable with ambiguity,
Mm-hmm.
right? And very few choices we have in life are binary, right? And very few choices are clear-cut choices.
Right.
There's a lot of ambiguity in life. Now, we know that because we grew up before the digital age. We are not digital natives like our kids are. We're digital immigrants. That's what they call us. So, we understand that there's a lot of ambiguity and gray area, and you can't just make a quick response choice to life's biggest questions. But young people are really trained in the swiping, and that's what I refer to from something that was coined as cognitive tindering or cognitive tenderization.
Right. Right. I'm going to take a break soon, but I just want to, talk about that a bit because I think that certainly you can see the impact on, my son's generation, but I think I'm not sure how to characterize it, but it seems like we're kind of regressive analysis where basically my generation is trending that way, even though it may have a greater impact, on our generation behind us.
Yeah,
um, People, are seem to be reprogramming their behavior, in that direction and there does seem to be, I know, I guess partly, when you're when we're struggling with so much ambiguity in life and so much uncertainty coming out of, the pandemic and so forth, that there is this tendency to gravitate towards some certainty and ratchet down this ambiguity, but it's there. So um
it's there. And what you said about, being almost addictive is true. And one of the reasons why it's not healthy is because that kind of activity and that kind of thinking is keeping us from doing the things that are healthy
mhm,
and will help us attain greater longevity.
right.
And that's what I want to talk with you about after the break.
Right. Okay. So that's perfect timing. So, folks, we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be talking much more with Dr. Sherry Kelly, clinical psychologist and neuropsychologist. So, don't go anywhere. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with neuropsychologist Dr. Sherry Kelly about the impact of digital technology on us as we age, actually, at any age. But before we continue, I just wanted to let you know you can find out much more about Sherry's workshops, seminars, lectures, and programs for people, families, parents at her website. It's mindandheartcoaching.com. Is that right, Sherry?
That's right, mindandheartcoaching.com.
Great. All right. Okay. So before the break, we were talking about a lot about the impact of digital technology on us as we age, and a lot of the uh, perhaps you know unfortunate impact. A lot of there are a lot it's lots of positive stuff, but as Sherry has pointed out to me before, that you know technology may neither be positive or negative, but it's not neutral, and it does sort of steer us by its architecture into certain behaviors.
Right.
um, so but we want to talk about what we can do about it. As a journalist, when we would tackle large subjects, and we'd do a series of articles, 7-part series. What I found always a little bit troubling was we would do 6 parts on diagnosing the problem and 1 part on the solutions, and I would say to people, we really need to flip that. People really want to know what to do about these problems. So let's
Right.
talk, Sherry, about what people can do. And I think a lot of it really is about managing digital technology in our lives. Is that right?
Yes. So the first thing that you can do about it is what you're doing right now is learn about it, be curious, be
Hmm.
skeptical. There's a writer, Mark Normand, who gave this great synopsis of what social media is.
Hmm.
He says social media is like looking in the fridge over and over. You know there's nothing good, but you check it so many times that eventually you start consuming things you don't even like.
That's a great, great way to look
Yeah.
at it. Yeah.
So, remember that or I should say, realize that a lot of the stuff you're looking at on social media and entertainment media is there to have you buy stuff.
Hmm.
It's, consumer in its goal,
Hmm.
consumer, targeted, and it's attached to marketing platforms. The second thing to remember is that oftentimes you are the product.
Mhm. Right.
not what you're looking at. Okay. You're the product. You're being sold, your information's being sold, or you're being monitored. Even, artificial intelligence is gathering all that information from you, from your behavior online, even, on certain platforms where they can see the camera, what your expressions are or
Mhm.
what your responses are. So you've become now the product and you're being sold, and it's being used to develop some types of artificial intelligence, as well as being used for consumer data
Right.
about purchasing. Okay. Um, the other thing that you can realize or do actually is to track your usage. We
Mhm.
all have that capability on our smartphones to see how much time we're spending on social media. And you should actually do that. It will be illuminating, and do it with your kids and grandkids
Mhm. Mhm.
to see, how much time they're really using. The other thing is that it's really important that you cut out time and schedule time each day to get off social media, to get off your smartphone or away from the computer and spend time outside. There's
Mm.
more and more evidence from the field of eco psychology
Mm.
on the health benefits of being outside.
Mm.
And that's going to really help you. The next thing to do is to carve out time each week to be with friends or family, and you
Mhm.
actually have to schedule it
Mhm.
to not be on your device, but to actually be in face-to-face conversation,
Right.
so that you have that connection to someone in person, not
Yeah.
just over Zoom.
Right. Right. Yeah. I love this concept of eco psychology. Again, it's sort of intuitive. People do talk about, especially as we age, getting outside and nature has a sort of a calm effect. It's people talk about, the sort of as being in nature as meditation.
Yes.
Tree hugging is literally, helping you um, sort of center yourself and sort of see yourself as part of something greater.
Yeah.
So, I think that is important. And, I experienced this, unwittingly as a child. My family grew up in Long Island when Long Island was much more rural, and we grew up in, luckily, next to a farm and 360
Oh,
acres of woodland, going out in nature was just what we did, or what I did, because it was there. But I can recall just the real meditative effects of of not not you know, not being in um, the whirl of our daily lives. So
yeah. And we have really such limited time for that now in our daily lives. We are either commuting in the car or on the train, or we are not commuting at all and doing work from home and sitting behind screens. So really, the more that you can carve out, just even if it's a half hour a day,
mhm.
to take a walk outside, to meditate outside, to be somehow, in the environment, not just inside.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other things you talk about, which I found fascinating, was just again a little counterintuitive, but when think about it, true, which is dealing with our avoidance in society of painful emotions, and
Right,
using social media to escape that, and how
right.
sort of acceptance of these things is important.
Yeah, and we do. I mean, it scrolling, swiping, channel surfing, on YouTube, they're all ways that some people use to try to deal with anxiety.
Hmm.
It gets your mind off of your problems. It sort of gives a big distraction. So I just I ask people to think about these 4 questions when they're
Hmm.
on social media,
Okay.
which starts with, am I seeing posts, or am I seeing things on social media that are actually making me unhappy or happy.
Mhm.
Okay. And, so, how are you looking at the negative things online or the positive? And of course, the psychologist Rick Hansen says, our brains are like, Teflon for positive things and like, Velcro for negativity.
Mm.
And that's, part of our survival mechanism. We tend to dwell and think on the negative, but the positive we just let slip through.
Right.
And so what are we focusing most on? The other question is, do I follow accounts on social media that make me feel like I need to be someone I'm just not?
Mhm.
Do I have, a sense that I'm missing out on something?
Mhm.
Kids call it FOMO. And that, flows into the third question I have. Are you comparing your life or your body or your success or your stuff with what other people have online or on social media or on Facebook? Because a lot of what people post isn't true.
Right.
There's whole industries to make you appear to look more affluent than you are, or more successful than you are, or filters to make you look thinner,
Mhm.
taller, better looking. And then the last question is the big question. Is the way you're using social media affecting your mental health?
Mm.
Is it affecting it negatively?
Mhm.
Are you feeling worse? Are you feeling worse about yourself? Are you finding that you're not spending as much time with others that might really need you because you're spending too much time on social media?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. For good questions. Yeah. I mean, the negativity hits home with me a lot because, that's, I experienced people talk about that when I was a reporter and editor for many years, people complaining about the media being negative, always so negative, always so negative. But I think what you point out within, if you understand it, is important. That's part of the, the this it's their scene function to alert you to things that might be a problem for you, might be dangerous, might be things to watch out for. So once you understand the role of it, then you can essentially basically accommodate it. And I think one of the problems is that there's so much media focusing on so many negative things that it's once again the amount that's really detrimental and
Right. And that's what sells. You
right,
know that better than I do.
right.
And so there are numerous studies that have been done really over the course of the past 10 years, and some that have been done recently from 2019 to currently published in 2022
Hmm.
from the CDC and the NIH that show an association between the amount of time you spend online and reported symptoms of anxiety and depression.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so while you're seeking this distraction because you feel anxious or depressed, it's actually contributing to making you feel depressed and anxious.
Right, right. Now, one of the things that you've talked about, and I've heard other people talk about it too, in terms of, you know, monitoring expectations of yourself, is a notion that known as backward design. Right. Talk about that a bit. What does that mean?
So, as we age, I think it's important to build happiness based on what your goals are,
Hmm.
what you really want out of this life going from 45 forward.
Right.
And where do you see yourself in 30 years? Where do you see yourself in 20 years, 10 years, 5 years? And taking stock of those expectations. And this is a great exercise that I love doing with couples and also with intergenerational families,
Hmm.
where we talk about, okay, well, where do you see mom and I in 20 years?
Hmm. Hmm.
And your adult child might see, oh, it's easy. I see you having a great house in Florida and we're spending a lot of time there and you're paying for the grandkids' college.
I see.
um, Or, with your spouse, where do you see yourself in 20 years? Oh, I think we're going to be, climbing in Peru, or I see us sailing on a nice cruise in the Mediterranean.
Mhm.
Well, let's look at that, or is it, oh, I see myself going back to school and taking courses and teaching or
Mhm.
giving back now that I'm going to be retired. So it's important to just examine what differences there might be, but also examine the reality of your expectations
Mhm.
as you age. Is it realistic to think that you're going to be well enough in 20 years to go hiking in Peru?
Right.
Or are you going to be healthy enough to teach in 20 years like you might want, or to have that, financial security to have a house in the South?
Yeah.
Um, so it's understanding also what your partner's expectations are and looking at those differences.
Right.
And then, this is where we get into happiness as we age, because a lot of unhappiness as we age, I believe, evolves from differences we have in the expectations of ourselves versus reality,
Right.
right? I was expecting to be well enough to go climb Machu Picchu, or I was expecting to be well enough to take that trip through Europe, or expectations of the spouse.
Mhm.
I was expecting you to share this with me, and now you might not want to.
Right.
You're not interested in that.
Right.
So looking at expectations is is an objective exercise. You don't have to
Mhm.
take it personally. It's a way of not looking at yourself, Ron, but my expectations.
Right. Right. And I think in some ways too, we talked earlier about sort of ambiguity in life, and I think that this is one of the things where, it can, in some ways, help these stress situations by just helping you focus. So if this is where you think you're going to be, expect to be in 20 years, what do you need to be doing now to, to
Exactly.
get there?
Exactly. So you look at, what you need to be doing now, what steps you should be taking, how to prepare for it.
Hmm.
And also, what you might want to do together with your loved ones or your partner. Um, because it's that difference in expectations where the sadness or the unhappiness also arises,
Right.
not just within yourself, but expectations between you and your loved one.
Right. Right. And one of the things that you and I have talked about before is just this unusual difference too in the way men and women look at themselves in terms of how they age, right?
Yes,
That
we laugh about this.
yeah.
Yes. So oftentimes when I work with couples, the man will say, I'm frustrated in some ways because I don't feel like I'm 65. I feel like I'm a 37-year-old trapped in a 65-year-old body.
Mm,
And the woman typically will not feel like she's 35. She'll feel maybe even older than her stated age. I'm tired. I've given up everything. I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm 80 and I'm only 60. So, it's again, it's looking objectively, okay, well, what's your life right now? What are you gaining pleasure from? What are your goals? And it's that backward design, looking at where do you want to be 10 years from now? And how do I get there
mm,
with this next phase of my life?
right, right. Yeah, a lot of questions here. But but great things to
They're
think
all
about.
really good. They're all really good questions to
Yeah,
ask yourself.
yeah.
And you have to have, three things for your flourishing as you age. According to Dr. Martin Seligman, the three
Okay.
things are agency, which we talked about, having some self-efficacy,
Hmm.
having a game plan, making the future work, not just not being lazy or reactive, but being proactive. Optimism, an optimistic attitude. Focus on the positive, not the negative. Focus on gratitude, not on what you're missing out on. And then imagination and creativity. Be
Right,
creative about your future. Have some options open to you and be creative with what you might want to do in your life. Be flexible
right.
in getting what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of things that, as we said starting out, a lot of things are within your control. There are options that you have that
Yes.
you don't realize you have. And I think that, Yeah, a lot of the stress and the feelings of depression as you get older is this feeling that you don't have options, sort of this, you're stuck in this
You're
tunnel vision.
stuck. And
Yeah,
and when you don't have a choice, that's when you become a victim.
right, right.
And you don't want that.
That's right. That's right. We don't want that. So we're on that note, we're going de-victimizing ourselves. We're gonna take another short break, Sherry. So, folks, we have one more terrific segment coming up. So don't go away. Much more in our last segment with Dr. Sherry Kelly. Welcome back, folks. We're talking with Dr. Sherry Kelly about finding ways to manage the impact of digital technology on our mental, emotional, and physical health. Before the break, we were talking about lots of things about aging and managing digital technology. So we're going to take a shift in this last segment to talk about aging at a younger age, dealing with Sherry's still a lot of things with children. She has her workshops with her daughter, and a lot of this focuses on the notion of what we can do about it, again, in terms of positive psychology. So, but first, Sherry, tell us about, your work with children and specifically your workshops.
Thanks. We've been working since 2018. My daughter and I have been working together since 2018, which is interesting and fun. We started Positivity Teens workshops. And this really came out of her experience with the Parkland mass shooting in our old hometown of Parkland, Florida.
Hmm.
And she saw everything unfold in the palm of her hand through her iPhone. Luckily, she was at a private faith-based school in the town next door when this happened, but my
Hmm.
husband was working literally down the street,
Wow.
Parkland, when this happened. He is a doctor and he was working at a medical clinic that day. So, one of the things that my daughter, who was 14 at the time, asked me when I went to pick her up from school that day, she said, "Why is it easier for a troubled teen to get a gun than to get mental health care?"
Hmm.
Which was a really profound question from a 14-year-old.
Hmm.
And it got me thinking. And then in our community, we realized that there were a lot of kids that needed access to care, and it was really hard for them to get free mental health care or to get resources. So we worked together to establish Positivity Teens to provide resources and free workshops and webinars for kids, families, teachers, and educational staff who might want some support, might want to get connected with somebody to help them with therapy or just grief support in the aftermath of Parkland. And we went on to develop a webinar series and workshops on how social media is affecting teens
Hmm.
and what it's doing to them and why are they depressed and
Right.
what you can do about it.
Right.
So not just the problems, but the solutions. And
Right.
can you code your brain for greater happiness? Yes, you
Right.
can. So
Yes.
that's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's expand on that. How do you? So we've talked a little bit about this, but I think this is an important concept of
Yeah, and it
recoding your
works.
brain. Yeah.
And it works for all age groups, not only teens, but it works really for all age groups. And even Steve Wozniak, who is the Apple co-founder,
Right.
he has this great quote that says, "Happiness equals smiles minus frowns."
Hmm.
Okay.
Right. Right.
So, first step is to realize that a lot of what you see on the media, social media, internet is negative, and it's there for a reason. And Ron, you know very well
Right.
because you're in that business.
Right. Right.
And realizing that you have more power than you think to attract happiness, to become more positive in your life.
Hmm.
You have more power over your brain than you even think by how you make decisions to think about things. And I'm
Right.
being very simplistic, but happiness, positivity is a conscious decision that requires practice.
Right.
You don't just think, "Oh, I'm waiting for happiness to come find me." You're
Right.
going to go find it.
Right.
And that's a decision you have to make. It's changing how you think about things.
Right.
right? And it's clarifying goals for your thoughts, for your processes of behavior. And you use your internal resources that you have, your strengths, what you're strong in, what your belief system is in finding happiness and seeking it out.
Right.
So you actually work on this daily. So one first exercise I have for you, it's not easy, but try it. Try not saying something negative for 24 hours.
Hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's a good way to start. Just try it out and see how you're going to change. Just
Mm-hmm.
in 24 hours, you're going to feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Here's another one. Understanding that a lot of your anger and a lot of the things that drive you into feeling down is because you're putting the brakes on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And you have to think about, oftentimes it's fear of losing something, fear of failure, fear of making a mistake that's making you put the brakes on.
Right.
When you want to try something that's going to be life-changing, or you want to get happier, you may want to make a change in behavior, but you're afraid to, you're putting the brakes on.
Right. Right.
And understand that's often a fear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So no matter how hard you press on the gas, it's hard to move forward if you've got your foot on the brake, right?
Right. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I think certainly fear is one of the central elements, right? You're afraid of failing, even
Yeah.
though what the consequence is really not failing. It's just not succeeding the way you thought it would, you know?
Right. Exactly. Okay. And you have to change the way you think,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not going to get different results if you're still in those same negative, thought patterns.
Right.
The other thing is to prepare in advance
Mm-hmm.
for negative encounters, stressors, disappointments. And I call this shooting par, PAR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Prepare, accommodate, and reframe.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that stands for.
Prepare,
Okay.
accommodate, and refrain. Good.
Right.
Okay.
Now, if you're a golfer, you're going to remember that really easily.
Right.
Okay. So this is what we're going to do. And this is a good thing to practice. Also, another strategy. I want you to prepare in advance for a conflict or a negative encounter or an argument or something that might be stressful. And what you're preparing for is not that event as much as your response to that event.
Right. Right.
Okay. Because we can't always control what happens to us, right?
Right.
We'd be spending our lives in a closet, right? Or under the bed.
Right.
But we can prepare for our response set. Okay. And a big chunk of our happiness or unhappiness will rest on the fact that you have to make a choice of how you want to respond to a situation.
Right. Right.
So prepare in advance for how you want to respond. What's that person you want to be look like?
Right.
Are you going to be calm?
Mm-hmm.
What if somebody insults you? What's the response you should do? Prepare for, the what you can do about it, rather than why do I feel this way?
Right. Right. Yeah, I think, this lasts all the way through life. I mean,
It does. It lasts all the way through life.
one of my previous guests, you might be interested to look back at. I had a guest on a few weeks ago named John Leland, who is a New York Times reporter, but he wrote a book called "Happiness Is a Choice." Um,
Yes.
and and the book was based on spending a year with people who were 85 and older.
Mhm.
And so,
Interesting.
he was expecting that these people, it was basically, premise was that, okay, the fastest growing segment of our population is 85 plus. So what's life like for this demographic? And he was surprised. He found, in fact, that it was, so happiness may be a little bit of a misnomer, but it was a sense of fulfillment, and that these people
Right.
were felt that their life
Fulfill.
had purpose. And they said exactly what you said now, which is, well, I make a choice to be happy. And I guess the phrase was in spite of, as opposed to if only, so
Right.
they were accepting of life. They're accepting of what life dealt with it. And a lot of it was not great, but but that was part of
A
their
lot of it's
expectation.
not, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's so true. And it relates to what your concept of happiness is and what the science of happiness is. And that's a whole other show. But
Right.
happiness, and we have the great Harvard study that was done, started in 1937 with
Hmm.
some, people call it the George Valiant study. But you look at this study and it's tracked Harvard graduates from 37 all the way through the 80s, I believe, and
Hmm.
what makes a fulfilling and happy life.
Right.
And it's not the, jump out of the cake, confetti, trip to Disney, big bang. It's being able to be satisfied with your life, finding meaning and purpose in your life.
Right. Right.
That's exactly what you said.
Yeah.
And getting back to, PAR, we did the P, the A is accommodating for the
Hmm.
stress when you're in the middle of that storm.
Right.
How do you accommodate? And you have to think about, okay, I can accommodate by finding choices. I have two choices in how I want to react now that I'm in the middle of it. And what will happen if I react in a certain way? So I visualize, and I teach people to visualize two doors, a green door and a red door. If you go through the green door, you're going to have more options. If you go
Right.
through a red door, you'll have less options.
Right.
But you have a choice on how you want to react. And you can calm yourself, whether it's by breathing or by using techniques like stopping, taking a breath, thinking about what your options are before you proceed. That's the A. And then the R is for reframing,
Hmm.
cognitive reframing.
Right.
I am going to think back, this wasn't a loss, I handled it well, or I may be disappointed, but I learned something from this experience. I'm seeing the positive in this. The positive is, all right, I didn't get what I want, but it's a good thing. It would have been a disaster.
Right.
Or, this person's not in my life anymore, but that's a good thing. I grew from better without having that person in my life.
Right.
So it's, reframing what happened to you in a positive,
Right.
something that makes you stronger, not weaker.
Right. Wow. Well, there's much more to talk about, but unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this program. I'm sure I'll have you back, Sherry, for another show. And I just wanted to mention to people that one of the shows you and I talked about is that, and we can't get into it today, but that you're in fact working with your colleagues in Ukraine to deal with a lot of the disruption there, with both refugees and people leaving the country and coming back. So that's going to be a fascinating show. Uh, well, I don't haven't scheduled yet, but we will definitely have you back for
We will
that.
have it, and we will have a colleague on with me from Ukraine on the
Terrific,
ground. So you can
terrific.
hear somebody on the ground in Ukraine with who I'm working with.
Right. Great. Okay. So, folks, if you missed my conversation today with Sherry, you can still listen to it on voiceamerica.com. Just search for my show, 45 Forward, and you can hear it on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or go to my website, roelresources.com, and click on the 45 Forward tab. If you have comments or questions, email me at ron.roel.com at gmail.com. So be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be talking with John Farrell, the author of an interesting book about how what we think about today in terms of modern technology actually came about in a time we never think about, the Middle Ages. So until then, folks, keep going forward, 45 forward.